Hello, and welcome to the third in a series of podcasts for Standard and Benchmark 3.2 for 10th grade biology. In this podcast, we'll be discussing photosynthesis, both light-dependent reactions and the Kelvin cycle. For Kalani High School, this is the Allaire Report, and I'm your host, Mr. Allaire. Before we delve into the process of photosynthesis, I want to go back and just review a couple of things that we discussed in class. First of all, photosynthesis occurs in chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are a special unit of plant cells that contain smaller parts called thylakoids. Thylakoids contain the chlorophyll, which is the light-absorbing pigment that makes photosynthesis possible. Now, photosynthesis is essentially a series of chemical reactions in which water and carbon dioxide are reactants and oxygen and sugars are the products of that reaction. Now, before we get into photosynthesis, we do need to discuss one last thing, and that is NADPH. NADP, or nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate, is a special carrier molecule that plant cells use to transport high-energy electrons to other molecules. You can think of these high-energy electrons like red-hot burning coals that you might have in a charcoal grill. The NADP comes along and scoops up the two high-energy electrons along with a hydrogen atom to become NADPH, and it basically transports the high-energy electrons wherever the cell needs them to go. So just like you might use a special tool to pick up some hot coals, NADPH is a special tool that plant cells use to transport these very high energy electrons that have been excited by the absorbed sunlight in the chloroplasts.
Someday we'll find it.
Now, the process of photosynthesis takes place in two parts. First, you have the light-dependent reactions. For light-dependent reactions, we're going to discuss this in 5 basic steps, starting with photosystem 2, then the electron transport chain, followed by photosystem 1, then the hydrogen ion movement, and lastly, ATP formation.
Have you heard voices? I've heard them calling my name.
Remember, the whole point of photosynthesis is for plants to create their own energy and their own food from the materials in the environment around them. Photosynthesis involves, again, the absorption of light, the absorption of water, carbon dioxide, and releasing oxygen and sugars that the plants can use. The light-dependent reactions aspect of photosynthesis is responsible for producing oxygen gas and converting ADP into ATP and NADP into NADPH. ATP is the unit of energy that plants need, and NADPH is the high-energy electron carrier that cells use to transport high-energy electrons. Light-dependent reactions begin when the pigments in chloroplasts, namely the chlorophyll, absorbs light in what's called photosystem 2. Now, photosystem 2 was discovered after photosystem 1, hence the sort of backwardsness of this whole process. When this occurs, the electrons get energized, and at the same time that light is being absorbed, enzymes break down water into 2 electrons, 2 hydrogen ions, and 1 oxygen atom. The oxygen is eventually going to be released into the atmosphere during this process. Once these electrons have been energized, the high-energy electrons are transported via the electron transport chain from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1. Meanwhile, energy is being used to transport hydrogen ions that were created by breaking up a water molecule from the stoma, which is outside of the thylakoid, to the inner thylakoid space. Now, once these high-energy electrons are transported from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1, NADP picks up the high-energy electrons along with the hydrogen ion and becomes NADPH. Now, because all of these hydrogen ions are collecting in the inner thylakoid space, the inner thylakoid space becomes positively charged. Outside of that space becomes negatively charged, and it's this difference in charges that provides the energy to make ATP. Now here's the problem. The hydrogen can't get through the membrane. So cells make a protein called ATP synthase, and this creates holes that allow hydrogen ions to pass through the membrane. As the hydrogen ions pass through, ATP synthase binds to ADP to produce ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now ATP is great. It's the stuff that plants want to have because it's the currency that they're going to be using to do all the things that plants need to do. However, it's only good for short energy bursts. It's not very good for storage. So that's where the Calvin cycle comes in. The Calvin cycle is basically a series of chemical reactions where ATP gets transferred into something that can be used for more long-term storage, like glucose. In the Calvin cycle, ATP and NADPH from the light-dependent reactions we previously spoke of are used to produce high-energy sugars, like glucose. Now, the Calvin cycle does not require light, so this part of photosynthesis is sometimes referred to as light-independent reactions. Remember, we talked about light-dependent reactions, reactions that need light. The Calvin cycle does not need light in order to proceed. So plants can do the Calvin cycle whether the sun is shining or whether it's nighttime. Now, the Calvin cycle begins with carbon dioxide. 6 carbon dioxide molecules enter the cycle from the atmosphere, and they combine with 6 5-carbon molecules. The result is 12 3-carbon molecules. These 12 3-carbon molecules are then converted into higher energy forms. ATP and high-energy electrons from NADPH are used in this process. So we've got these 12 3-carbon molecules. Well, 2 of the 12 3-carbon molecules are going to be used to form various 6-carbon sugars and other compounds. These are going to be for the long-term storage of energy that plants can use later on whenever they need them. The remaining 3-carbon molecules are converted back to 6 5-carbon molecules. These will combine with 6 new molecules of carbon dioxide to begin the next cycle of the Calvin cycle. Now, I understand that both the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle can be a little bit confusing, so let's take a look at this flowchart here. Photosynthesis includes light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. Light-dependent reactions use energy from the sunlight to produce ATP, NADPH, and oxygen. They take place within the thylakoid membranes of chloroplasts. The Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma and uses ATP and NADPH to produce high-energy sugars. These are the 2 halves that make up photosynthesis, which is the process that plants use to make energy and food for later use. Now, there are several factors that affect photosynthesis. These factors include the amount of water that's available, the temperature of the surrounding environment, and the intensity of light that's shining on a plant. All 3 of these can have either a positive or a negative effect on the amount of photosynthesis that is occurring in a particular plant or a particular community of plants. For instance, if you forget to water your plants like Mr. Allaire often does, then your plants will not be able to photosynthesize and therefore will not be able to make any energy or sugars to use later on, and they will die. To compensate for extremes in some of these, some plants have evolved over millions of years to develop protective casings. For instance, cacti that live out in the desert will have a waxy surface in order to keep water inside of them so that it doesn't transpire and evaporate into the atmosphere. Well, you've reached the end of Part C, not the end of Part B, like it says on the slide that you're viewing. Sorry about the typo. And so please make sure that you go back and review this slide show a couple of times. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in class. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
And I think it's what I want to be.